Welcome to episode 38 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Today we're beginning Book 3 of Lucretius, and we'll be discussing the Latin text from 1 to approximately line 93. Let's join the discussion now with Elaine reading today's text.
O Epicurus, who could first strike so clear a light from so great darkness, and direct us in the proper advantages of life, thee, the glory of the Grecian name, I follow. Thy steps I closely trace with mine, not so much from a desire to rival thee, as from the love I bear, and the ardent passion I profess to imitate thee. For how can the swallow contend in singing with the swan? Or what can kids with feeble limbs perform in running with the noble horse's speed? Thou great father, founder of philosophy, thou with paternal precepts dost inspire thy sons, and from thy writings, most illustrious chief, as bees suck honey from the flowery fields, we feed upon thy golden sentences, golden and fit eternally to live. For when thy reason first began to prove that nature was not formed by powers divine, the terrors of the mind all fled, the walls of this great world lie open, and I see how things are managed through the mighty void. The deity of the gods, their calm abodes appear, which neither winds disturb, nor clouds overflow with showers, nor the white falling snow, congealed by sharpest frost, does spoil. But the unclouded air surrounds them always, and smiles on them fully with diffused light. Nature in everything supplies their wants. Nothing at any time destroys their peace. But the wide tracts of hell are nowhere seen, nor does the interposing earth prevent our sight, but we discover what beneath our feet is doing in the space below. In these pursuits, a certain divine pleasure spreads round me, and I stand amazed that by the strength of mind, all nature every way lies naked to our view. Since then I have taught what are the first seeds and principles of things, how they differ in their figures, and of themselves fly about, beaten by mutual strokes, and from them all beings are produced. The nature of the mind and of the soul comes next to be explained in these my lines, and all the terrors of infernal pains banished, and headlong driven quite away, that from the bottom so disturb the life of man, and cover all things with the gloom of death, and leave no place for pure and unmixed pleasure to possess. For what men vainly talk, that disease and infamous life are more to be feared than the terrors of death, and they know that the soul consists wholly in the blood, and therefore they want no assistance from our philosophy. I would have you observe that those boasts are thrown out more for the sake of praise and popular breath, if their vanity by chance leads that way, than that they believe any such thing. For let these very men be banished from their country and driven into a desert far from human sight, stained with the guilt of the foulest crimes, yet they live on, afflicted as they are, with all sorts of misery. And wherever the wretches come, they fall a-sacrificing, and slay black cattle, and offer victims to the infernal gods. And in this deplorable state they, with more than common zeal, apply themselves to the offices of religion. And therefore it is proper to view men rather under a doubtful fortune, and observe how they behave in circumstances of distress. For then they speak truth from the bottom of their hearts, the mask is pulled off, and the real man shows undisguised. Besides, covetousness and the blind desire of honors, which compel unhappy men to exceed the bounds of right, and urge on the partners and assistants of their crimes to strive day and night with the utmost pains to arrive at the height of wealth, these plagues of life are chiefly nourished by fear of death, for infamy and contempt and sharp want seem far removed from a sweet and pure state of life, and, as it were, hover about the gates of death. And wherefore will men, possessed by false fear, labor to avoid, and stand at the remotest distance from them, They add to their heaps by civil war, and insatiable as they are, double their riches, heaping one murder upon another. They laugh with cruel delight at the sad funeral of a brother, and hate and fear the entertainments of their nearest relations. From the same cause and from the same fear, envy often becomes the tormentor of mankind. They complain that one is raised to power before their eyes, another to respect, a third distinguished by shining honors, whilst they lie buried in obscurity and are trod upon like dirt. And so they pine themselves to death for the sake of statues and a name. And some men, from a fear of death, conceive so great a hatred for life and the preservation of their being, that in a gloomy fit they become their own executioners, not considering that this fear of death is the source of all their cares. This breaks through all shame, dissolves the bonds of friendship, and in short overturns the foundations of all goodness. For some we see betray their country and their dear parents, striving by that means to deliver themselves from death and the pains of hell. For as boys tremble and fear everything in the dark night, so we, in open day, fear things as vain and little to be feared, as those that children quake at in the dark, and fancy advancing towards them. This terror of the mind, this darkness, then, not the sun's beams, nor the bright rays of day can scatter, but the light of nature and the rules of reason.
Elaine, thank you for reading that. This opening of book 3 is like the opening of the other books. In my mind, some of the best writing and most important material in the poem at large. And it really conveys the depth of feeling, I think, that Lucretius had for Epicurus. It's so easy to get tied down into the details of atoms and void and not to realize that the big picture is that Epicurus is essentially one of the greatest figures of human history. How different the world would have been and history would have developed had Epicurus's views become the majority and become the leading philosophical school instead of what actually happened after the rise of Christianity and the sort of takeover by religion for so many centuries. Because you can read through Lucretius in these opening passages of these books and see that he's looking at Epicurus as a father figure or as almost a saint or a savior in many ways because of the significance of what he's talking about. The significance of Epicurus is not the details of atom and void, but the liberation that he brings to humanity by realizing that we're not the slaves of supernatural gods or the slaves of religion, and that we do have the ability to come up with and understand a method of living that allows us to live happily. So there's just so much in this opening section, and I don't want to go on too long there with that statement, but this is not a science course. It's not just some kind of dry discussion of the way things are. The way things are significant to us because we live our lives and we have feelings and we want to make the best of the use of the time that we have available to us. And Epicurus is not just one of the landmarks that you can learn from as you go on through life, but he's really one of the most significant figures, in my opinion, in human history for the way he puts all this together and the way he popularized it. And but for the development of the first century BC and the Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire was on the verge of understanding these views as a dominant outlook on life. I was mentioning earlier that we came across an article from a man who was advocating that Julius Caesar himself was a Epicurean. It just seems clear from what we have left to us from Cicero that so many of the leading figures of that time had seen the importance of Epicurus. We know how Friedrich Nietzsche discussed that in several of his works. And there's a depth of feeling that is involved in studying Epicurus that goes far beyond the science. So with that statement, what do you think?
So, I always like to ask Martin first.
Martin.
Because we're kind of similar in how we see things sometimes. So,
So
what do you think, Martin? What's your reaction to this passage?
Yeah, it basically uses a lot of poetry to state that how Epicurus' philosophy has liberated mankind from religion.
Yeah.
Martin, I know that as people listen to our podcasts, and especially the last 10 10 or so or whatever, we've really got into the details of the atoms, that your commentary has often been about some of the details of the atomic theory and to what extent that they are continuing to be valid, to what extent they need to be revised and so forth. And so people listening to the podcast probably associate you as an example of someone who really enjoys reading the details of the Epicurean physics. So with that having been established as sort of your general perspective, how does someone like you evaluate these more general or more emotional or these more general aspects of Epicurus?
Yeah. But I mean, basically, this what I just said. I mean, I don't see that I could say anything more about this. It just illustrates the same point.
Well, where I'm going with that is, given your deep interest in the scientific aspects of it, how do you yourself look at the life lesson aspects of Epicurus in comparison to the science aspects of it?
Mm-hmm.
Elaine, help me ask that question better, because you know where I'm going with it. I think that would be of interest to people to talk about it.
I think you're asking, Cassius, what is the thing you appreciate most about Epicurus's work, the science writing or the how to live philosophy of pleasure? What is most meaningful to you?
Of course, how to live, because science. I mean, I'm a scientist, and we've done a lot more. We went way beyond Epicurus. So that one is just to see the consistency, so that we look into the details, and also to make clear that it wasn't about the details of the science behind. Those were just there again to illustrate how everything can in principle be explained back to natural causes, and how many of these old explanations are turned out then later to be false doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So, but what matters is that we openly put pleasure as the goal, and this wasn't obvious before.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was obvious to some people, but it certainly needs argument in support of it. When you go through, I mean, Epicurus was living in Athens, when you're surrounded by people who are discussing philosophy or who approach philosophy as a science of its own. It needs to be explained in terms where pleasure becomes supportable and legitimate, and you can understand the reasoning behind it, and it's just not arbitrary. A lot of people make arbitrary assertions about how to live. Maybe that's one of the commonalities we all have, is I think we're looking for an explanation and a set of reasons why this one is, in fact, the best one to follow. And assertions aren't good enough.
Right. I have a kind of an interesting reaction to this section, and I'm actually especially going to be interested, Cassius, in how your reaction is different from mine, because as I've discussed before, that I had already come to the major conclusions that Epicurus came to without knowing that Epicurus had come to them. I hadn't put them together in the way that could defend against some of these other philosophies, although I had a lot of pieces of that. So I appreciated his defenses for his philosophy, but I already knew the modern basics for what we know about physics. I was raised an atheist, so I didn't experience a feeling of having been liberated by Epicurus. I agreed with his philosophy because it was my philosophy, and that's how I knew he was right. because he agreed with me, which is a real different thing than from learning your philosophy from him and feeling liberated. So I'm curious about, for you, did you have this feeling like Lucretius is describing, like what Epicurus did freed you up from some misconceptions that you'd had?
Yeah, I would say generally yes, but maybe the explanation would be that I'm a lawyer by occupation, and I consider myself more of a generalist. I've always been very interested in physics and science, but I've been more of a generalist in reading a lot of different political philosophers and general philosophers over the year, just some general philosophy in college. And so I guess my perspective is that I've been aware and focused on the fact that there's just so much disagreement out there in the world about all these issues, about religion, non-religion, atheism, theism. And all this disagreement seemed to me to have no way to ultimately have any confidence in which one was correct. I guess maybe I was coming under the influence of just a more and more skepticism over the years and just thinking in the end that there's just no way to be confident about anything. And what seems to me to be the significance of Epicurus to me personally is that here is an example of someone who this is not a very attractive argument, but I do tend to take some account of what I guess leading figures of history have said and who said what and whether I think they're the type person based on their actions that ought to be listened to. And when I finally understood where Epicurus was going, or thought I understand where Epicurus was going, I realized that here is probably the number one figure in Western civilization who people throughout history after him have recognized as having a unique take on these issues in a way that I don't, like you were saying, Elaine, you come to your own conclusions, and I guess I came to my own conclusions as well. But you do like to think, you do want validation or some idea that there's other people out there who see things the same way. That's one of the tests, I guess, of truth under Epicurus as well, as you check your observations against those of other people. And if you don't have some way to validate your observations against people who have reached the same conclusion, then that was, at least in my way of thinking, a big problem. That, okay, if I'm the only person seeing this, then maybe, in fact, there is something wrong with the way I'm seeing it. Epicurus, when I've gotten into the details of reading what he wrote and not what just these commentators have been saying about him, seems to have really put the big picture together in a way that I've not seen anybody put the big picture together. Various people get various aspects of it in a way that seems to me to be consistent, but then they'll frequently just drop back and just totally default on religion. Or I went through a period where I was really into the deist arguments and so forth, and some of the Thomas Paine material in specific. His Age of Reason was a big influence on me. And now I think to myself that Thomas Paine didn't go nearly far enough, that he had before him these arguments from Epicurus that if you admit that there's the watchmaker or clockmaker theory still presents a problem when you think that everything is supernaturally based in the beginning, even if you think that there's no intervention and providence active today. So I guess I hope I'm not getting too far from your question.
No, you're not at all. You're not at all.
In terms of the liberation aspect of it, though, I do. I guess I'd use the word validation more so than liberation, but
okay.
until I think there's again, I'm projecting myself into other people, but in thinking that there is a large number of people in the world who are sort of generalists who basically end up being beaten back and beaten down into submission to think that there is no reason to have confidence in any answer to any of these ultimate questions about whether there's a God and life after death and things like that. And so unless you, again, from my perspective, unless you can take confidence in a particular method of reasoning about these issues, you're always going to be plagued with doubt that when you die, you may go to hell and be tormented for the rest of eternity. And the only way to get rid of that doubt for somebody like me is to have a system of understanding that seems to make sense and is based on evidence that seems persuasive. And so even though the details of some of the physics may no longer be the best way to describe it, the general conclusions and the big picture just seem to me to be absolutely persuasive and absolutely compelling in dismissing virtue as a reasonable way to base your life or any of these idealistic Platonic arguments about there being eternal values that are true for everybody all the time at all places. That was an issue in reading Cicero for me. Through my legal background, I knew that there's this rationalistic argument that there's a basis in law that's the same for everybody all the time in all places. And to see Epicurus directly confront that and say that that is absolutely not the case and cannot be the case due to the nature of the universe gives you a framework which you can just throw all the baggage away and start from scratch, but not arbitrarily, but on a foundation that you can validate for yourself by studying nature. So Yeah, I retain a lot of this. Epicurus is a really special figure, and
Yeah.
whether you consider him to be a father-like figure, or as he discusses at the beginning of one of the following books, you consider him to be almost like a god. Obviously, that's something that's figurative and not literal, depending on your definition of the word God. But it's the kind of thing that I think is a significant part of Epicurean philosophy. It is not just a set of words in a book. There is a personal aspect to it, which is appropriate when feeling is so critical to Epicurean philosophy, that you need to be able to feel why it's right, in addition to understanding the logical arguments that are presented in support of it. And I've got to go a little bit more on that. Just the point being that there are a lot of logical arguments that are dispersed through all this material that I think was necessary to him and necessary to many of us even today, because if we come up in a framework where we've been educated under a system that forces us into this theistic or Platonic format, then we have to find a way to battle our way out of that box. And Epicurus is, in my view, the way to battle out of that box. I think the difference in our perspective, Elaine, a little bit, is I'm not sure you ever got caught in that box of the Platonic idealism and the religion way of analyzing things.
Yeah, so I'm surrounded by it in the culture, so I don't think there's any way that any of us probably can be raised free of that. But I fought my way out of it before I met Epicurus.
Mm-hmm.
I guess is what I would say. So for me, I don't see him as a liberator. I was excited to read him mainly because I thought, okay, I can probably find other people who have what I had come to see as my really weird, idiosyncratic kind of philosophy that nobody else probably had, because I couldn't find anybody with it, But I'm like, here, this historical figure who thought this way. I bet there's other people out there who agree. This is how I find them.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my excitement about finding him, and also a feeling of affinity with him as just thinking, wow, he thought this way. I feel friendly towards him, even though he's gone. So when I read this, I put it in the category of kind of guru worship. It bothers me, and I of the three of us, it may be that I'm the only one, but I have seen people make heroes out of other humans, and I have never seen it go well.
Right.
It's just a bad idea. And so I wouldn't recommend to people that they do that with Epicurus, that they set up that kind of dynamic, but people may disagree with me on that. I think Epicurus probably would have disagreed, because he thought it was important to, I think, hold him and the other prominent leaders in his school in high esteem, and the gods, these gods to hold their ability to achieve this pleasure in high esteem. That's a kind of a worshipful thing, and that's not for me, that doesn't lead to pleasure. It leads to disillusionment, because then you find out, this person was human. Like for Epicurus, people, he had slaves, so we can't listen to anything he said. So that is one of the problems with setting up these heroes, so that the person gets conflated with the information that they gave, and it can lead people to then discount the accurate things that they said. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, there's clearly a tension there that I think Epicurus would agree with you about, the issue of being extremely careful and not allowing something to turn into a worship situation or a cult situation where you blindly, unthinkingly, and inflexibly adopt a position that somebody else has taken just because they've adopted it. Those are clearly incorrect. That was one of the things we discussed in what you read recently, Elaine, in one of the texts at the end of book 2, about how when you come across something new, you need to look at it closely and either whether you're going to embrace it or fight against it, depending on whether you think it's correct or not. You're not going to just take things unthinkingly. On the other hand, I mean, it's just, there's a spectrum of issues that I think are involved here. and maybe the one that comes to mind right this second is when you're dealing with, for example, children or somebody who's in a position where they need to know something right now, but they don't have the capacity to understand all the reasons behind it. When you're dealing with the child or whatever, it can be, I think, useful to set up examples of conduct that they can use as an image that lets them visualize something while still keeping in mind that the visualization is not fully real either. It's also something that has to be questioned and kept clear in your mind, because even though you may think Epicurus or Thomas Jefferson or any figure of history that you might identify with had good attributes that you want to emulate, you also know that they were human just like us, and they no doubt did things that we would disagree with today. And that's just kind of the nature of the atomic universe, that things are so contextual. Only the existing context is real, and to idealize an idea or a person or anything is going to lead to problems if you don't continue to keep the grasp of the difference between the real and the ideal. Epicurus is not the ideal leader or an ideal man, because there's no such thing as an ideal man or an ideal leader. And I think that's ultimately the essence of his philosophy, so that if you understand where he's going, you're best acclimated to resist that. And so, I agree with where you're going. Clearly, cultishness and worshiping people and blindly accepting things are a prescription for disaster. But I think that Epicurus was teaching that that's exactly what you have to avoid. But at the same time, your parents, I'm not going to try to personalize this as to your particular situation, Elaine or Martin or anybody, but we have a lot of affection for our parents and for the leadership they gave us when we were very young. And so we love them for that leadership in most cases anyway. And appreciate that. And it's not just an intellectual assessment that my father was right or my mother was right. It's a feeling of deep connection with them because of so many different reasons.
Oh, yeah. So affection would be an accurate word to describe how I feel towards him, but I don't feel leadership from Epicurus to me. I feel more like we're equals, which is probably, I think some people in philosophy get this idea that, well, I got called to task on our Facebook page, last year for being disrespectful to Nietzsche, that I wasn't respectful enough, just because he was seen by that person as a great man. I was not supposed to criticize him or poke fun at him for something he said. I think I called him emo in one passage that he did. So I don't think we should fall into that trap. I think we should feel free to treat Epicurus and anybody as a contemporary. And I don't mean to discount them at all. I mean, I do think I appreciate him very much, but I wouldn't put anybody in a leadership position like that. And maybe that's some kind of bias that I have. I don't know.
I would see that as another issue of context, in that if you need a leader and you're looking for a leader, then you start finding particular people to set up in that role. And I would say Epicurus, in my situation, he's a philosophical leader at the very least. He wasn't actually a social reform leader, maybe. He was not a military leader, certainly. It's just there's just a context in which if you're going into college and you're a philosophy student, you may end up really thinking that Epicurus is your number one leader in the world, because you're really engaged in philosophical debate and so forth.
I think what I'm trying to get at is, if people take that mindset, they will feel uncomfortable questioning, criticizing, challenging that leader. It is just going to feel wrong to them and feel like it's a betrayal maybe of that leader, when just, like with our friends, we can point out problems that, like if we're making mistakes in our reasoning, our thoughts, we can tell each other that, and it's not unfriendly. So we can do the same thing with anybody that we're getting good information from. Our teachers, I would say that I'm okay putting them in a teacher role, but you have to feel comfortable questioning your teachers challenging them sometimes. And I think if I had been around in the garden, I mean, can you see me? I would have been saying, "Oh, Epicurus, yeah, you're breaking your own rule about, with your reasoning." I think I would have called him on that, and I don't think I would have felt like I was being disrespectful.
I think he would have appreciated that, and I think he would have not seen anything inconsistent with that attitude at all. What I'm hearing in what you're saying, Elaine, is just the current healthy attitude that it is a big mistake to idealize people and things and movements and so forth, like we have today in so many different areas. And at the same time, Elaine, you would have your own circle of close personal friends and family who you correct and you discuss things with and so forth, and yet they
would correct me.
And they correct you. Yeah. But where I'm going with that is that their significance to you is different than maybe the people you come into contact with on the internet, who you're really just totally intellectually exchanging ideas. I mean, everybody has probably, this is the friendship aspect of it maybe, which is such a deep issue in Epicurean philosophy, is you really have, you're not just exchanging ideas, there's feeling involved.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I have affection for Epicurus. I feel like we would have been friends. I'm not sure he would have known what to do with me, but
well, I think what you're raising are very important considerations for everybody, because this is a very even though we're talking about our attitude towards Epicurus, I think it's a very philosophically based issue of what are we doing here? Are we just simply putting words down on a screen and our piece of paper and discussing ideas that are very disconnected and abstract from everything, or are we dealing with basically feelings that can seem like they're life and death to us and may in fact be life and death to us? I mean, this is one of the examples in today's text about people who don't understand these issues have such a fear of death and a fear of life that they even end up committing suicide because they have not come to terms with what the reality of life really is. I mean, here's Lucretius and Epicurus, who don't believe there's a life after death, who don't believe any of these things that so many people today say is required to have a meaningful life. And they're the ones who are telling you that you need to embrace life and not commit suicide, whereas the people today would say that, oh, you're teaching material that would lead anybody to commit suicide because it's so horrible. And it's just the opposite is the truth.
Martin, you've been so quiet. I want to... What do you think about all this?
I didn't hear anything disagreeable from both of you. I mean, I'm more like you, Elaine, so that I recognized my own rudimentary philosophy in Epicurus' philosophy. So it's not that I needed it to figure this out, but it was like what Cassius said. So it was very helpful in getting affirmation from an independent source. So before that, I was known to be abnormal. Everybody knew I was abnormal, who knew me close.
Right.
But in a way which was, like my professor put it, which was actually in a good way abnormal. But it was still abnormal, and it was, maybe I'm completely wrong with my ideas about this. And if you see, then there's a whole philosophy out there for thousands of years who goes exactly in that direction, then you lose this doubt.
Right.
Martin, what were you doing that was considered abnormal?
Oh, a lot of things. Eating dessert before the meal often, then...
Everybody that goes through medical residencies knows to do that because you might get paid.
All kinds of things like that. So that I did put a lot of more efforts than the average German student on study. So that was also then something abnormal that I wouldn't occasionally I would go out with the other fellow students during the PhD time, but they would go out way more often, and I would just stay back until late at night in the lab. So that was, from a German perspective, abnormal. So here in Asia, it's not abnormal at all.
Interesting.
Martin, I hope you understand when you hear many of my comments are intended either to be joking or they're always admiring of you and what I observe about you. And of course, this caricature or the stereotype I have in my mind about Germanic culture and Germanic attitudes towards science and so forth. But so much of what we discuss comes down through Germanic attitudes, people like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, who I don't know a thing about. Most of these German intellectuals I don't know much of anything about. I think you've done a lot of studying, certainly a lot more than I have in any of those. And so that's why I'm interested in, that was my question earlier too. The stereotype is that there's sort of a analytical or very scientific, very, I don't want to say the word detached as much as whatever has led to the understanding that German engineering is generally so superior to other types. There's this kind of an analytical approach that is, again, I use the word stereotype of a German attitude to it, which I kind of translate into just a general physicist's attitude or whatever. So that's where I'm interested in when you said that you were considered abnormal, or you considered yourself abnormal, what it was that took you out of that mainstream stereotype and might have attracted you to Epicurus or pointed you in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, because, for example, this hard study, that was clearly the result of hedonic calculus. No? So that in the use you put your effort in, and because reasonably you can expect to get old enough to reap the benefits. So it's different from the logic I heard from people who just don't put any effort in. Or if tomorrow a stone falls on my head, then that it was for nothing. No? But it's very unlikely that this happens. So if you go for what is likely, it just makes sense to put effort in hard study and hard work in the use. No?
And how did you come into contact with studying Epicurus or Lucretius?
That was much later. I mean, that was 2016. That was I was following leads about something unrelated in reading a book from one of the former prime ministers of Germany. Then this led me to the meditations from Marcus Aurelius, and there was then Epicurus was mentioned a few times on something what wasn't even referring to his philosophy, but I was interested in that particular detail, looked it up, couldn't find anything, but by chance I discovered, Epicurus' philosophy is my philosophy. So it was absolutely by chance, by following some leads in literature without really aiming at this in this particular instance. I mean, that I read this politician's book, and then Marcus Aurelius, that was I was looking for, from an eclectic perspective, for bits and pieces of wisdom, as I had some found before, than with other philosophers, but I didn't expect that finally I would find a consistent whole philosophy which matches me.
Was there particular parts of it that you identified as being similar to your own philosophy?
Yeah, that was this hedonic pleasure for this hedonic calculus for pleasure. This was the key thing. Nothing supernatural. No? That you don't need anything supernatural for everything you need for your life. No? So that then adds to it. No? That makes sense. What I wasn't aware of, that you can build a whole ethics on this one, because the standing statement I learned in Germany that when you do science, you cannot come to ethics. But Epicurus showed how you can come from science to ethics. I mean, it's not as conclusive as you come within science from one step to another. So you have choices, and you may choose not to do so, but you can come to an ethics based on the science.
Yeah, I agree. Some of the things that actually caught my attention first, that there were, where I was considered myself to be a weird kind of outlier compared to my friends, were things like that it's possible to be satisfied, that we're not insatiable. That was a huge one, because there's this, I think, coming partly from Buddhism, but maybe also from Judeo-Christianity, that we're naturally insatiable, which I knew wasn't true because it's not what I observed to happen. But then there, right in the beginning of reading Epicurus, I saw it. I thought, well, there you go. I may be weird, but there's other weirdos out there. I think that caught my eye even more necessarily than pleasure as the goal, which I didn't realize was something other people would disagree with as much as they do.
You didn't
Yes.
see any controversial nature
I
to
did
that.
think that should be, yeah, right. And I didn't realize how opposition to that was actually at the core of why people were disagreeing with me on some of the other specific things. Yeah, didn't occur to me that they didn't want to be happy. uh,
And see, Elaine, I'm still working on better ways to articulate what I'm about to say. But when you said a moment ago that one of the things that impressed you was his observation that it is possible to be satisfied, to me, that is so interesting to me because Epicurus is often considered to be an atomist and he's into physics. And so that's what we're studying, so many of the details of his empiricism and his physics and so forth. But the issue of it's possible to be satisfied is really more of a logical deduction or a conceptual argument to me than it is
really?
than it is physics. At least to me it is.
To me it's an experience.
Okay.
So I would have these arguments with my sort of neo-Buddhist friends, and they would talk about how we're insatiable, and we can't be satisfied, we got to get rid of the ego. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm satisfied quite frequently. I don't want more to eat when I'm full. I don't want to sleep more when I'm ready to get up. What do you mean? Why do you think we're insatiable? And that wasn't at all from logic. It was just, that's how it feels. I don't feel insatiable. Why do you think we're insatiable? And I never found anybody who didn't argue with me on that. Oh no, there's the hedonic treadmill. We're insatiable. We can't be pleased. I'm like, is it really like that for you? Do you don't think you ever feel like you've had enough of something? I found that very bizarre. So I was really thrilled to read that Epicurus would eat and get full and find that he was plenty happy, having plenty of pleasure. And when I use the word happiness, I will just remind our listeners, I'm just talking about pleasure. So when you're happy, you're having pleasure, which I think is the normal way to use that word.
Well, my comment on what you just said would be one way to bring all this together is I think you're focusing on the practical feeling experience of being satisfied at times.
Yeah.
And so therefore knowing that you can be satisfied. The same question can be evaluated from the different perspective of the logical arguments involved with Plato and Philebus, and when they argued that pleasure cannot be the highest good because it can never be satisfied.
Right.
And then Epicurus coming back with this argument that you can satisfy pleasure because the limit of pleasure is when all of your pain has been gone, and so your life experience is totally filled with pleasure.
But I see that as an experiential argument, not as a logical argument.
I see it as both, but I see where you're coming from, Elaine. I do see where you're coming from. That logic without experience based on it is worthless. That the only kind of logic that really makes sense is what is based on experience and reality that we can confirm, would be the way I would look at it. They come together that way.
But you see that as primarily
I see that
more logical than experience, because I see it as entirely just descriptive.
I see it as something that is necessary for me in order to have confidence to reject these arguments that are telling me it's not true. You're saying that you didn't ever think it was particularly controversial because you just saw it as being obvious. Well, maybe I'm just the type person who has been browbeaten into thinking that, okay, it's not obvious anymore, and I need an intellectual way of analyzing it and being comfortable that it's true.
Oh, interesting.
And maybe this is go ahead, Elaine.
I think that why people don't understand that is because they're ignoring their experience and they're feeding into this.
But they're told that they have to, Elaine. They're told that their experience is worthless. Plato says that the horses you see in front of you are not real. The only real horse is the ideal horse in heaven, basically. So, if you, depending on the background you come from and your teaching and so forth, many people are browbeaten into believing that you cannot trust your senses. That's the ultimate point of so much of Platonic philosophy, is the senses are not trustworthy. Right. And so your feelings are not trustworthy. If you've been through this incredibly, whatever school of Ayn Rand, you've been taught that emotions are not tools of cognition. You're not supposed to use your feelings
Yeah.
as a test of anything because they vary. They can't be trusted. Never trust your feelings is a strong perspective in many of these philosophies, it seems like. And Epicurus just goes head on against that and totally turns it on its head and says, how can you know anything other than, and so, the people who tell you that you can't know anything, they might as well be standing on their head, because there's only one source of solid belief and solid confirmation in reality, and that is your senses and your feelings. And so that is another thing that when I saw him, I'm like, well, of course. But until I saw all this together, I didn't realize that is why other people were not understanding these things, that why they thought they were insatiable was that they were Platonists. So it brought me a lot of clarity when I would have these conversations that I just thought were like, why can I not communicate with this person? I think that's probably the biggest thing that I got from Epicurus, is that now I see why. It's because they're Platonists. And it makes so much more sense to me that I don't feel like quite as weird talking to those people, because I know what it is specifically that is happening. So that's clarified a lot of communications. I don't seem to be able to transmit my sense of clarity about that to the Platonists. They will just keep arguing. Yes.
Epicurus. See, well before I read Epicurus, I would argue about the atheists having their day of reason by, no, you need to have a day of evidence, because evidence is the primary thing. And then I read Epicurus, and I'm like, you got that. You were already there. How cool is that? So, well, one extension of what you just said, though, is that the day of evidence you're talking about is going to include your feelings as part of that evidence. Evidence is not just a dry syllogism in a Platonic sense. And that's one of the reasons why, in my opinion, you do hear people come back and talk about Nietzsche on a regular basis about some of this, because Nietzsche was highly anti-Stoic and denounced the Stoics in very strong terms on these particular issues of this kind of an idealism they were into. And he was, he's considered to be a very emotional, but he also saw in Epicurus how he had identified many of these issues and was fighting them before the rise of Christianity, and how one of the things in his Antichrist book that I always remember is his talking about Lucretius, and how what Lucretius was combating was these religious views contained in to some extent Christianity and to some extent Judaism, several of these different ideas about life after death and fear of being punished and so forth. And because the Stoic Platonic line of thought ended up merging largely with this religious Christian Judaic view of a theistic universe. And so you've got all of that religion and Plato and the Stoics and so many other different perspectives all aligned largely against Epicurus on the other side, with certainly many other people who had parts of it that they were together with him on. But the big picture to me comes through Epicurus as, from that point of view, the ultimate expression of that strain of Greco-Roman civilization that was the alternative path that could have been chosen, but was not chosen due to all the different influences of the rise of Christianity and religion and Stoicism and so forth. So, more pontificating for me there, but we probably ought to begin to come to the end of today's episode. It's been a particularly good one, I think, that I will probably promote as one of our better ones. But as we make closing comments, it's tradition to let Martin go first.
So it's just to repeat what I said before. So a lot of poetry praises here Epicurus, that he helped mankind, basically showed mankind a way to get out of the grip of religion. That's all already.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
guess I'll just say that there's some beautiful poetry here, and that I appreciate the feeling of enthusiasm about this philosophy and the affection that's part of the practice of this philosophy. the affection for Epicurus, affection for each other, that we found other people who understand us despite the Platonic world not getting it. So I'm really glad about that.
And my last thought would be that when you say that you appreciate the affection, you're making, in my view, a deeply philosophical statement that it's not just the dry scientific affirmation that, yes, he got atoms right, or no, he didn't get the size of the sun correct, but he was still kind of interesting the way he thought about it. It's not just an intellectual assent to it. It's a feeling that here is something that is of practical, pragmatic use for yourself and for other people who really want to live happily, want to make the best of their lives in the time that they have, and who see that life is worth living because of the feelings that you can experience while you're alive. So I'll close on that note, I guess.
Great.
So thanks everybody for your time today, and we'll do it again next week.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.